Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we're going to hear from Ashley Sherwood, who is a principal analytics engineer at Hubspot. Ashley talks about permissionless innovation and how to get shit done in large organizations. This episode focuses on tools for how to lead an organization along the modern analytics journey. And Ashley also offers some career advice for data practitioners.
Julia, I'm always the one that causes us to get the explicit tag on our podcast, but you ruined it. I was clean this time. This episode was so much fun. One of the things that I see happening in the data community is that folks that work at like small and agile companies that adopt new technology very quickly often lead a lot of the conversations because they're using the cool new stuff before everybody else. But one of the subtexts that I heard from Ashley was that she works at a company that she's very proud about the fact that they're very human focused and data isn't the very first priority for them, and that they're not always adopting new tools like very first. And that's not a problem. In fact, I think that she takes a lot of pride in that aspect of her job. And so it's just taught me a lot about how there's different ways to be best in class as a data professional.
Yeah, and not even just that, but they were able to re-accelerate innovation and shift the mindset from what does the data team do for our company, and instead ended up way better off by saying, no, actually, we need data because they help us be better as a business, which I thought was really cool to see as well. But this is a really great episode, especially for practitioners. Ashley has lots of fun ideas. So without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, Ashley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You almost have a persona in our internal DBT Labs Slack because our coworker Jillian talks about you so much. I feel like everybody knows you, even if many of us have never met you before. And I have to say that Jillian has prepared me with a couple of really hard-hitting personal questions. The first one is, how is it being the older sibling of triplets? I have never met anybody who's a sibling of triplets before.
It is a wild ride, to say the least. And they are 17 now, about to go to college, which has been just a magical time of sharing what I've learned with them, getting excited for them, helping them find what they're passionate about. And I remember things now from this era, because when they were small, it was just survival mode, hold everything together, hold it down.
You were probably old enough to change some diapers in there, right?
Oh, yep. Lots of that. Lots of corralling kids at the mall. If you ever want to not have the people at the mall kiosks solicit you, the answer is to have a stroller of 3 infants that you're pushing through the mall and no one will talk to you. It's a great time.
Okay, cool. I'm sure there's many war stories there. We have all become very used to the idea that K through 12 students are getting educated online more than ever since 2020. But I think you were a trailblazer in this regard. Can you tell us about that?
I was. So I was a military kid growing up. My dad's U.S. Air Force, so we moved every few years. And we would go in and out of school systems. So I would have experiences where I would do the round of testing in one school system for class placement, and then I'd move to another school system and have to redo all of the testing for class placement. So throughout that process, my mom made some good relationships with some of the teachers at the schools who were running some of the special programs. I was one of the gifted and talented kids, shout out to the others who ended up in that category. If you test well and you're excited about school, that can happen often, especially if you're in a good school system. So I had that when I was in Virginia, and then we moved from Virginia to Arkansas, and schools in Arkansas are really underfunded and really struggle to provide some of the support that those students need and deserve. I was lucky enough to be coming from a different context and have some options. So there's an online school curriculum called K-12 that's really trying to do solid, world-class science-informed education in terms of what's the science of how kids learn, how do you introduce ideas. And they were running a public school virtually in Arkansas when I moved. So I was able to go to that with no cost to my family, do that for 7th and 8th grade. I fell in love with it. I was like, I'm sick of doing vocabulary. I'm going to block schedule myself and do all of my vocabulary in the next 2 weeks and then never do another vocabulary assignment. So it really clicked for me, and I stuck with it through high school. And then it just made moving that much easier to have a consistent curriculum and friend group. And I met my husband through that school in high school. And yeah, it was a really neat experience.
I think it's so neat when you give kids much more autonomy early in life. I think that so consistently they will impress you by what like the maturity of their decision. Most of us have to figure that stuff out in adulthood, and I think you had a head start on many of us.
Yeah, it gives you a bit of that safety net to try things out early when the consequences are moderate, so that by the time the consequences become more severe, like when you are managing yourself in college, you've had a chance to try some things, fail, and build those skills before you end up on your own.
Yeah. Come to the present. You got peer pressured at Coalesce 2021 into starting a Substack. I don't remember exactly how that happened, but I remember there was like a loud outcry from the people. We want more of Ashley. I think you've written 2 issues so far. Is that right?
There were a few starters just to seed things. And then I think so far, the big ones have been talking about opinions, talking about growth stage at a scale up in a butterfly metaphor, and then sensitive people and kind of what we can learn from how we treat sensitivity in a scientific concept to a more knowledge-based workplace.
So each of these posts has been very influential internally. It's generated a lot of conversation and readership, but it's very noteworthy to me that it is not possible to mistake your voice and your point of view for anyone else in the data space. You have a unique way of writing, of expressing yourself, like even the ideas that you are clearly bouncing around in your head are a little different. Here's the obvious unanswerable question. Like, how does that happen? Like, where do the ideas come from? What gives you this unique perspective?
That's actually a really great question that I have more of an answer to now than I even would have a few years ago. And getting into it with the sensitivity articles, I think, an important part of it. The ideas of neurodiversity and neurotypes and traits are entering more and more of our general cultural zeitgeist. They've been around for a long time, really, especially in like the 80s and 90s, we start to get this language together, and it's just continued to evolve from there. So what I can look at in terms of where these things even come from, sometimes I don't feel like I know, things just click. But I think a lot of it comes to being a sensitive person, being a deep thinker by nature, like very fundamentally by the way that neurons develop in infanthood, are influenced by some of these genetic traits to make people deep processors and make people sensitive. And I have the particular luck of the draw of having deep thinking on an analytical wavelength. And I've always loved words. I loved talking as a kid. I've always been chatty. I loved reading. And I've always been fascinated about how you get a point across. And I think in some ways, being a weird and different person and wanting other people to understand me really challenged me to learn how to describe things in a way that I wouldn't describe them, but that will work for somebody else. There's challenges involved in that. I haven't been able to be my true self in a lot of contexts growing up, and I'm learning what that looks like now and kind of growing into it. So I think it's a mix. I think it's that deep thinking, that being different, eccentric, seeing things from another angle, that being fascinated with communication and finding ways to get these words across, and then just the experience of, for most of my life, thinking of things a different way than other people and having lots of practice trying to explain where I'm coming from, and also trying to learn where other people are coming from when they have such a different angle on something than I do.
I think that's so well put. And we're going to talk a ton about like Ashley the human throughout this episode, because it's very closely entrenched with how you do everything, including your work. And I want to talk a little bit about your time at Hubspot, which is, almost 4 years, a long time at a company. And you call HubSpot, a scale up. It's, publicly traded company, almost $25 billion market cap at the time of this recording. Things change, but it's been public since 2014. So lots have happened in this company journey. The company's doing really well, but what I want to know is, how does the data team change over the course of 4 years? And are there things that are uniquely scale up about it, or maybe even trending enterprise about it? And how does the role of the data team shift in that growth story?
That's a great question. And I think it depends in an org on whether that org is truly data first or not. And I think especially when you're a data person, data first feels like the right way to do things. For me, it's much more what's the right fit for your org. I would say that HubSpot is very human first. If a problem can be solved by having a slightly longer and more empathetic conversation with a customer, that's how the company wants to handle it, as opposed to trying to automate that away. So we're biased to keeping human touches in the process, to really hearing people out and trying to give solutions that benefit that individual customer. And that means data isn't first. That means automation and efficiency aren't first. We are having to really grow out those skills now that we're scaling. So that's some of the big shift that we're seeing now. But in terms of the evolution of this data org, it's going to feel the most familiar to other people in companies where data isn't first, something else is. For us, it's that human piece. So in my time at HubSpot, I came in when we were still pretty new off of running derived tables on a cron job. So orchestration was kind of new. People are figuring this stuff out. It's pretty scrappy because you're not hiring data leaders to run your data first strategy. You're trying to figure out, hey, this looks like a cost center on our balance sheet. How much do we really need to invest here? What are the benefits? And especially if somebody's been at the same company for a long time, it's hard to bring in that fresh perspective. So as HubSpot grew and was kind of in that middle size when I joined, there were a lot of people coming in who'd been at other places, seen how much benefit you could get out of a well-structured data stack, and could see that as the company was going to scale, we weren't going to be able to do what we needed to do fast enough if we were still flowing everything through the same central team of 5 people. So things went from being very much you had to know what you were talking about, you had to come into the conversation, nobody was going to teach you Git unless you found somebody who could sponsor that for you. Nobody was going to kind of give you the full tour of the back end because they had other truly vital things to do. Things were really busy. So the more you could come in and know for yourself, learn for yourself, and the scrappier you could be, the more success you were going to see. Then as the company's grown, we've gotten to the point where we need things to run more efficiently. We can't scale through just adding in more headcount. And people have been articulating the return on investment we're going to get from having cleaner data or from being able to run operations on a broader set of data than was available previously. And as those pains grew, more structure is necessary. So in my specific role, I've gone from being the one person who was a combo operations analyst, data analyst, analytics engineer, and project manager to now each of those roles having 4 or 5 different people filling them. And so we've gone from individual people being really scrappy and learning stuff quickly and trying to network with each other to having to build pipelines of how do we get this knowledge to the people who need it so that you don't have to be a Git expert to be successful, so that you don't have to already know everything there is to know about how to put a SQL query together in order to solve the problem that's in front of you, and really make it so that you don't need to just keep hiring unicorns in order to run your data org.
Ashley, you just said so many fascinating things. I want to ask Julia a question really quick. The thing that's so surprising to me about what Ashley just said is that it feels to me to be a very different trajectory than many companies that I've seen go through. Like, I've found that at the early stages, it's very easy to operate this kind of like pristine, perfect data stack. And as you scale, the challenge is like not letting entropy win. But it really seems like the journey that you've described, Ashley, is kind of going in the opposite, like you're actually decreasing entropy over time. Julia, are you hearing that same thing?
When you use the word cost center, like that's a very loaded term. And usually, earlier stage companies don't even think in terms of, okay, this is a cost center or a revenue generating effort, or how do you bucket these types of work, different types of work. And so to move out of a cost center into an area of investment is really, really hard. And as like Tristan said, usually it's the reverse, right? Like you start thinking about these things, when you're a much more mature company. How did that change? Was it just, there was one person really beating the drum and changed the whole organization? Was it lots of micro changes that shifted the mindset? I mean, that's like, we're moving mountains here.
Yeah, really good question. A lot of it had gotten into motion before I joined HubSpot, so I can give my best estimate, and I can only give my perspective, right? So I can share that and kind of where I see those things coming from. So HubSpot had gotten to a pretty good size, mostly with data in Salesforce.com, which it's an enterprise software. It can do that. As HubSpot as a product started to get into the CRM space, and we really wanted to build our own CRM, that led, but you go where the market is. So certainly learned a lot from the way that Salesforce has executed things, both in terms of things to emulate and ways to differentiate. And as we got into that CRM space, we wanted to be running our business on our CRM, but our CRM was targeted at small to medium-sized companies. And we, at this point, were a large company. So in order to run our systems off of our CRM, we needed to build the systems to fill the gaps between what the nascent HubSpot CRM could do and what we had been doing with Salesforce. That got us into the data warehouse in a new way. That got us into Looker in a new way. So Looker was relatively new to the company when I joined in 2018, and folks were kind of getting their feet under them, figuring out how to actually work with it. The data set that I came into owning when I joined was for our solutions partner program, and that had previously been run exclusively in Salesforce and had, over the past couple of years before I joined, been built into its own microservice that HubSpot engineers had created so that we could actually run our partner program within our own systems. That meant there were new data sources people hadn't used before. There was a new reporting framework. We unlocked a lot of stuff we couldn't have done in Salesforce custom reports, but also revealed a lot of the inconsistencies that happen when your source of truths don't line up with each other, when everybody in this team's running out of Salesforce and everybody in that team's running out of something else. So for us, moving to the data warehouse was later and was an equalizer in a lot of ways, and that we could finally start to see how these different frames of reference from different parts of the business weren't actually lining up with each other because we pulled them out of software and into an agnostic data container. So that triggered a lot of change in terms of who was doing what work. If you had asked somebody in 2016, how many partners do we have? That's a Salesforce.com custom report. If you asked that question in 2019, that was a Looker report pulling from our backend databases. And so that skill set changed from can you use the CRM tool to you need to understand SQL and entity relationships and how do these things work on the back end and how normalized do we want them to be and how do pieces connect together? So it created this opening for people with those SQL skills, and data structure skills, and a necessity for them. So the person who could have pulled you that report in Salesforce wasn't the same. So that could pull it in this sort of new world. So that kicked off a really rapid hiring spree from late 2018 through 2020 of bringing in people with these more general data skills to build out our insight into all of our reporting systems and data, because we'd fundamentally shifted the way that we were looking at things from Salesforce and Excel to having a centralized data warehouse accessible broadly to the company through Looker.
So this kind of triggers a conversation I had earlier this week, and I'll leave this conversation pretty anonymous, but someone reached out to me saying, oh, I'm so excited about DBT. I hear it's going to be the answer to all my problems. And then I was like, oh, great, let's talk. And we started speaking, and I realized they didn't have a cloud data warehouse yet. And it was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know these companies were still operating like this, because the data is in your CRM, or you have your, completely separate systems, and they haven't done the hard work yet of centralizing it. And so it's like, oh, well, actually have a couple of steps before using DBT to solve your problems. It's just like, you need to centralize things. But the reality is we all have our own echo chambers, and some of them are worse than others. But I happen to work at a modern data company, and I talk to lots of people that are really bought into this world and have done a lot of the prerequisites, the steps to be able to use the modern data stack. But I had this, realization like that, the world's not there yet. And sometimes our assumptions can be wrong. One of the things that I heard you say at Coalesce, which I think was really interesting, was, we're pushing metrics. We've spoken about it a ton on this show in past episodes. We're super, super excited about metrics. But you brought up, well, hey, the only way metrics will be powerful is if I can get them, all my other consumption layer, my BI systems, to speak that layer. I'm not going to be able to convince my, the data team wants to use Looker, maybe the finance team wants to use Tableau. And we have these fiefdoms that end up popping up where people get to pick their own tools, and they have strong feelings about not moving off of it. So it's only so powerful as if we can get that interoperability, and that's going to be hard. What else do you think that we kind of gloss over, or maybe just assume the world will work away, that perhaps is going to need a bigger push to realize that future?
I think it comes down a lot to how complex and dynamic is the space that you're trying to tame, if you will. So I think in some contexts, you do have issues of territorialism where the problems that two teams are solving are similar enough that which solution is chosen may be more a matter of individuals trying to exercise their own autonomy and preference than in the service of what's most efficient or what's most consistent. However, I think you also have cases where you're just dealing with two different parts of the organism. How you treat an injury on a finger is different than how you treat an injury on the trunk, and the tools that you use in those cases are going to be different. So when you have teams that have very strict regulation, or who are mostly doing looking back at large sets of data and telling stories but not doing much real time, Tableau can be a better tool for that type of storytelling than Looker is. But when you're operational, when you're dynamic, and when you need to be hitting the data warehouse with whatever's in it, Looker is a much better tool for that. So sometimes it comes down to what are the right tools for those specific contexts. And when those tools are different, that's where you start to get into this interesting question of what's the operating system that lets these different things plug in. And that's where, if that metrics layer can be that nervous system that takes a central signal and flows it through to everybody, then that can be really powerful. You've got a vertebrate there. But if you need different parts of the org to be really independent from each other and have their own closed loops, you're dealing more with an invertebrate octopus tentacle type situation where that tentacle has its own brain. So sometimes a central brain isn't the right way to solve the problem for an org. Different sub-brains can learn from each other, but one of the reasons that an octopus doesn't trip over itself is each of the 8 tentacles has its own brain, and those brains talk to each other. Sometimes that central brain works best. Sometimes those distributed options are good as well. And I think that in service of trying to optimize for not repeating ourselves, we actually miss some of the opportunities that autonomy can provide. So if you want two teams to move quickly, react to what their customers are saying, and just go for it and innovate, if you ask them to always check with the central brain, you're going to slow them down and they won't be able to innovate. If you give them free rein to innovate, they will duplicate effort with other teams. But that opportunity cost of duplicated effort weighs against the opportunity of truly novel innovation. So if you have 5 new ideas and 2 repeated ideas, you're way ahead of if you slowed your process down and only had 2 new ideas. So all of that to say, something like a metrics layer can be that central nervous system if the org is simple enough or hierarchical enough that it makes sense for everybody to plug in. Otherwise, you're going to just run into other constraints, like it works well enough for enough of the org to share their metric definitions through Looker that when we think about adding those same metrics for the machine learning team in Python, it might actually be better for us to redefine those metrics in the data science context for that team, separate from people who are working out of Looker, because their worlds are so different. And you lose the opportunities that your BI tool can create when you maybe move those definitions up into another layer that's more simple, even if it's more consistent.
I've got Slack open on the other side of my screen. I'm typing to Drew. Metrics layer's dead. Next idea.
Not dead. And I think it's just what's your org like? I think what you can learn from that is, who do you market this to? Because if you pitch me a brand new company, clean slate, and you can define metrics once and hook in a visualization tool to it and hook in a data science tool to it and have all of those dimensions defined, I think that's amazing. I can imagine that working when you have 5 things you want to aggregate and 30 dimensions you can cut it by. Our reality in HubSpot is we have 200 things to aggregate and 5,000 dimensions to cut it by. So we benefit from getting the actual dimensions into a UI that our end users can interact with, as opposed to being the definers of metrics as analytics engineers, just because of the really broad scale of the data that we have, and the fact that we're adding structure as we go, as opposed to seeding out from a starting structure.
I love that the realism baked into that perspective. And I think that it does get lost in thought leader space. I mean, this is like not how you sell Substack subscriptions. At the same time, like, want to suggest that like it's not unique to metrics.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
You think about things in the software engineering world, like there are plenty of organizations that use REST in parts of their applications and GraphQL in parts of, like, we almost never in sufficiently sized organizations make consistent technology decisions across the entire organization. And maybe in the grand arc of the next decade plus of history, maybe there will be standardization around an open way of doing this stuff. But I don't think that's by any stretch a foregone conclusion. To me, the metrics layer feels like dropping, this is probably an imperfect metaphor, but like dropping a match into something, and you're just like, I don't know if this is about to light on fire, or I don't know if this match is just going to kind of like die out. I think that it's exciting because it's an experiment, because like I don't think we actually know exactly how things will go.
I think one of the realities here is, like, if the goal is it needs to be absolutely everywhere, and that anything that reads data needs to integrate with the metrics layer, that's a losing battle. We're probably not going to get there, and nor do we need to. If you can get to like n equals 2, well, that's pretty good, because now you have 2 different teams or 2 different contexts reading from the same centralized information. It should be an unlock, perhaps as interesting or as big as like, hey, we have a centralized data warehouse, and now we can have all these disparate systems that used to be in silos are now in one space. And eventually maybe we can get n equals 3 or n equals 4, and then it becomes more powerful. But yeah, it's becomes really hard when people have these like strong affinities to tools because of their workflow, because they've learned off of, they're very comfortable in Tableau, or they're very comfortable in X, Y, or Z system. Like, ask your sales team to move off Salesforce. Sorry, HubSpot. but like, it's hard. It's not going to happen. So you have to figure out that interoperability.
Yeah. And it depends a lot on what's right for what org. So I think in terms of socializing a new technology, you need to believe in it. You don't know who it's right for yet, but you can bang the drum of, hey, this might be right for you, or hey, we think this is right for everything, and things will net out in a good place. And I think that's something, as people who are eager early adopters, can be easy to forget what that full adoption curve looks like. And sometimes there's a lot to be learned by laser focused, get this thing as far as you can get it. And then from my perspective as somebody at a mid-sized company, we're not a small scrappy startup anymore. We need reliability. We need enterprise featuring. So that gives a different perspective on how to evaluate these tools of, this is what it would have to look like to work for enterprise, it probably needs to evolve in the way that it's evolving now to get to that point, or to learn in what ways it can work at enterprise and in what ways it can't. So it's just a different and more balanced perspective on the potential of tools, because there are so many more moving pieces. So it helps provide that visibility of, where in the adoption curve of a technology like this is HubSpot, probably leading majority for data concepts, not leading edge, because we don't often have that level of risk tolerance, but certainly leading majority, and that we're thinking about it more and want to be part of that evolution of tooling more so than other enterprise size orgs.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what you call as permissionless innovation. And first of all, I love the name. Did you come up with these terms? Is this your love for vocabulary playing out?
No. So actually, I got that from Tristan.
Oh, Tristan.
Yeah, Tristan, do you?
I was going to say, that sounds familiar.
Our first call when I think Jill made the connection and was like, this girl, Ashley at HubSpot, is using DBT and you have to talk to her. And I told you what I was doing with the really hacky PowerShell script that I had.
I was horrified, yeah.
And you're like, that sounds like permissionless innovation. And I was like, yes, that is exactly what it was. So I can kind of give the very short version of that context, and then we can get into the idea a little bit more. But so this was when I was new to HubSpot. Jill had initially learned about DBT to throw back to her, and then shared that with another good friend of ours who worked at HubSpot at the time and has since returned, Nina, who had done a proof of concept with it. And then as I was coming in, Nina was like, all right, here's what I was able to get set up. This helped me think about the data modeling that I was doing in a better way. And then, hey, at Template SQL, all of our current orchestration is raw SQL scripts. You can copy paste the SQL out of this and into there, and at least have done your development and ideation in this, in the box of DBT with the tools that are available there. So I was like, yeah, let's get this set up. I've done command line stuff before. I'm not worried about installing things into Python. So I got that up and running. I used that to build out a new data mart for our team. It made it so much easier for me to map what I was doing, look for places to optimize, write good SQL by using DBT, and then it spit SQL out the other side. And I hate doing the same thing more than once as a principal. So I wrote this really hacky PowerShell script, and I used the analytics section of the DBT compiler to compile a shell for the script to make it fit with our status quo. And then I used PowerShell arrays to just pick up the actual script and stick it into the shell and throw that into the GitHub repo and make my PRs for me. So I had put this together, and Jill was like, Tristan, you have to see this. And then I explained it. It was like,
do not try this at home.
I don't recommend it unless you really cannot get somebody to pay for DBT for you or run it on your server. And it is better than writing the SQL by hand. But I really appreciated getting that kind of reflection back from Tristan of, yes, this is innovation. This is what can we do without disrupting the existing systems to prove that there's value, with that long game of how do we bring this innovation to the rest of the org. So there's a little bit of scrappiness and hackiness of knowing your stack really well so that you know what you can get away with in your stack to prove the value of a new tool. Mm-hmm. And then once you have that value prop that's live in practice, it's a lot easier to get other people to invest in it because the risk is much lower at that point.
So what happened from there? You were just like, hey, look at this thing I built. And everyone was like, all right, I'm sold. Or what was the next step?
So it started as sort of an underground thing where I was using it to be very efficient in my workflow and sharing with other people who were interested in it. And then, as is so often the case, it takes something else shifting in a different place, and you look for that opportunity. So I was on the analyst team for our partner program. HubSpot kind of chunks out into these different domain areas. We were large enough at the time that's how we were doing a lot of our data analytics and what was analytics engineering, but we didn't know to call it that yet. And the team that does that for our product analytics, like usage and form, all that sort of, what are people doing in the app? How are these products performing? They were also about to build out a new mart and wanted to do that in a scalable way. They wanted to hire a bunch of new analysts. So we've got clean slate. We need to hire a bunch of new people because we don't have the bandwidth. And we've got, this person's aware of DBT as a tool that can make all of that easier. So that helps the prompt if we have a bunch of new people we want to train, and we don't want to train them all on this status quo process. We want to train them on something more efficient. And then I have this running proof of concept of all of my models are built in DBT and then sort of shoehorned into the existing system. So that gave me the opportunity to put my hand up and say, hey, I actually have a running project. We can cut over my schema from being populated by our status quo process to being populated by DBT. We can build this net new team in that same way. And I had some specific recommendations for how to hook it into our DAG and how to do some of the orchestration that would be low risk and help mitigate some of the concerns that our data team had in terms of spinning this up as a sort of test experiment, but more like a beta of, if this works, we know we want to roll it out. And so that's what tipped us over to being able to get DBT actually running on our servers. And once it was actually running on the servers, there was a lot of organic interest in the tool and the efficiencies that it was providing. I was socializing a lot of that. And then the final piece was getting the BI team. So we have our central data team we call our business intelligence team. Though the way that vocabulary works in the market more broadly doesn't quite line up to how we're using it at this point. But so that central data team, getting them bought into it and able to recommend it to all analyst teams. And then that provided the sort of security and guarantee to the other analyst teams that this was an endorsed tool, there would be support, this is what we're committing to in the long run. And then from there, we were fully committed and migrated the status quo from what we'd been doing to being then fully on DBT.
So it's very strategic.
I, was kidding earlier when I said, don't try this at home, but you used the word hacking before. And I think that sometimes there's like this negative connotation of that. But much of the technology that we know and love, famously, many of the layers of the internet are kind of hacks. And they're just, they're hacks that proved to be incredibly useful, and they took off. They were good enough. And well, I actually had not internalized to what extent you had built tool. I thought you were doing copy paste, which sounded awful. But but you had actually developed your own tooling to make what was an imperfect workflow work much better for you. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of just that's like such good juju. It's like we in the data space, often because of the way our minds are shaped, to return to your point from earlier, we tend to prefer these like very clean, kind of perfect solutions. And I think that in technology, that's just not always the way that it goes. And we should be very, very open to the idea that there's going to be some chaos and some hackery.
I think it's a little bit even of being an analyst like a biologist. So this ties back into when I was in high school, I was like, what do I want to study? I love math. I love science. I was drawn towards biology because it's chaotic, because it's super unpredictable. And things that work one way in one animal don't work the same in the other. And things that happen 99% of the time don't happen 1% of the time, and you're not sure why. And I think there's a comfort that you have to have, or at least a skill set around dealing with uncertainty, thinking in terms of things probabilistically, breaking things down into smaller steps that you can tackle over time. That's more intrinsic in a study like biology than it is in a field like physics or chemistry, where once you get into the cutting edge, there's plenty of uncertainty there. But in the smaller ways that you engage with those as a, somebody learning science, they're firmer sciences, and that things are more predictable. And then biology has this chaos component to it. So it ends up being not surprising that this is the part of analytics that I'm most drawn to, the sort of like gooier or more organic human component, given, the chaos just keeps things interesting. And how can you manage it? How can you herd the cats? What's like good enough? And I think as you go through that process of, you have to have comfort with some degree of uncertainty, look for opportunities still and do what's going to be high return on investment. And then the more you can tune your instinct of what's right to do now versus what's right to do later, the more efficiently you'll spend your time. So there are a lot of times where I might be doing something and I'm like, I could make this perform better, or it would be more ideal to do it this way. I just take note of it in whatever frame I'm in. If I'm writing SQL, I make a SQL comment. If I'm writing a Python script, I'm going to add a comment there. If I'm in a Jira ticket for an issue, I'm going to document it there. Wherever is as close to the problem as possible, so that when that comes up again, when that performance is an issue and needs to be addressed, or when we do roll out the DBT project broadly, it was only once we decided to actually move forward with it that I did some of the things that I'd been planning to do, like move my column comments from the config file I had been putting them into the actual YAML structure for DBT, and clarifying some of the labeling. I always had that on my list, but I wasn't going to do it until I had a guarantee that other people were going to be in the project. And then once I got that guarantee, I made that a top priority to make sure it happens. And that's the difference between getting lost in over-engineering before you roll things out. So that's erring on one side. Erring on the other side is not cleaning any of those things up before you roll it out because you forgot. That also sucks. But can you strike that balance of setting yourself up for being able to act quickly when the time is right? And that really helps you thread the needle on stuff that you've hacked together and mitigate the ways in which it's fragile without wasting time over engineering before you have enough of a guarantee that that's going to be useful.
I love it. So we're going to wrap up the episode with a question we ask all our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
This is perhaps a bit aspirational in that it's very realistic, and I think it's a bit aspirational to expect people to broadly be realistic instead of aspirational, but that's its own rabbit hole. I would love for folks to have just a more grounded idea of what data is, what it's useful for, when it's useful. I think that in the leading edge spaces, it's good to have that excitement, that idealism, that being overly aspirational. You need that in research. You need that in academic progress. Like, you have to study the zebrafish, hoping one day what comes out of that study will cure cancer or do something important. Sometimes you just learn more about zebrafish. Other times you actually do discover something that's really broadly impactful. But I would love to see people recognize when they aren't the cutting edge. If you're a leading majority, if you're a lagging majority, the more realistic you can be about that and the less you get caught up in the sales pitch, the happier you're going to be with the way that you use your data. Sometimes the most important thing the data is telling you is that you don't have enough data to use data to make the decision. You still have to use good judgment. You still have to understand what you're looking at and who you are benefiting and who maybe has risks involved, and make good choices from that. And I think Ben Stansley gets into that a little bit in his Substack on Does Data Make Us Cowards? Like, it's really tempting to outsource the decision to data, whereas great decision makers are made better by data. Poor decision makers aren't made better by data. They're actually made worse. And so the more people invest in continuing to develop as good decision makers, I think the better we'll see data used and the less distracted we'll be by the shiny new thing when we actually have a clearer grasp of how can data help us here and how can't it.
Well, we just failed the Ben Stansel test. We failed to get through a whole episode without mentioning him or his newsletter. So we'll try again next time.
You have to give credit where credit is due.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. This has been fun. Where should people find you to learn more about zebrafish and octopuses and all of the other biological references that you love so much?
Yeah, animal fun facts really should be like a subtopic of my Twitter. So the easiest place to find me is probably on Twitter. My handle is Compiler Queen. I'm also on the DBT Slack community. Feel free to direct message me, at me in the channel. I love conversations like this, especially if you want animal fun facts, but I guess we can talk about data topics as well. And then my Substack is same username, Compiler Queen, and you'll find it from my Twitter pretty easily. I think it's in a pinned tweet.
Amazing. Ashley, thanks so much. This has been a very fun hour.
Thank you both as well. I have been so excited to find this community, and especially somebody coming from not the, well, I don't know that there's really a normal career evolution to get into data. I think going a meandering path is more normal than abnormal at this point, but certainly not something I would have imagined as a high schooler who wanted to be a forensic pathologist or a college student who is training to be a chemical engineer. I've been just so happy to find this community, so excited to engage in it and find people that are really thinking deeply about what data looks like in our world and how we can use that to impact the future.
Amazing. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks so much.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.